Did you know that one of the ladies who played the townspeople in that movie is Kay McConaughey, Matthew McConaughey's mom?
Oh, really? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That's fun.
The one that's sitting on like the porch with a lady next to her just laughing the entire time.
Yeah, okay.
She's the one that keeps talking about how he knew Marjorie and Bernie were sleeping together because Marjorie had bought like a see-through lingerie at the store. That's Kay McConaughey. And I feel like she's playing herself in that.
Yeah, well, it's not too far from a real life, actually, from what I can tell, because McConaughey he put out like a memoir of some kind earlier last year, and he was very forthcoming with details about his parents' sex life. So I feel like she would be very comfortable with talking about that kind of thing on camera.
Yeah, 100%.
Apparently his dad went out while having sex with Kay.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had a massive heart attack and died.
So I guess you could say he died doing what he loves doing.
That does a good job of setting a tone for this movie, which is kind of a weird little mix of both fictional scenes and documentary stuff. And I don't think I've seen anything quite like it in a while. Certainly not from like a director with Richard Linklater's stature. So I think it's worth talking about on that front. Welcome to another bonus episode of the Extra Buttery podcast. My name is Robert Snow in Toronto, and I'm joined by my co-host Jason Chen in Vancouver. This time we're talking about a movie from 2011, so maybe not a true classic in the sense of some of the other things we've talked about in this spin-off series, but we're talking about Bernie from 2011, directed by Richard Linklater, starring Jack Black and Shirley MacLaine. I can't remember exactly what drew me to this movie at first. It might have been a trailer that I saw when it came out, and I just sort of filed the movie away mentally.
Are you kidding me? You probably saw Linklater's name and you're like, oh my God, I have to see this.
Maybe. I mean, and I will confess.
Definitely. There's no maybe.
I will confess that I've made it a project to try to tick as many of his movies off the list as possible. Some of them are a little bit too weird and wild for even me, but yeah, but it was one of those things that I didn't rush out and see. Like compared to like the Before trilogy or School of Rock or even like the movie he made about baseball, like college baseball, Everybody Wants Some, from a couple of years ago. That was quite good. Bernie was just it was always like a lower priority for me. Did you know very much about it before I suggested it for this series?
I virtually had no idea this movie existed.
Okay, cool.
So that was a nice little, I guess, introduction, because there's a lot of movies that actually like really fly under the radar.
Oh, yeah.
If they're not like festival darlings or blockbusters. Like, I feel like weekly and daily I miss content, even on streaming sites. Like, I can't keep track of all the stuff that's being released. And like, never mind the fact that living in Canada, sometimes our options are limited because we don't have Hulu.
Yep, very true.
But yeah, this one slipped under the radar. I am a little surprised it did because it's got like a pretty A-list cast.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Linklater's director Jack Black is in it. Shirley MacLaine stars Marjorie. McConaughey is in it, as we've just talked about. I mean, that's a pretty good threesome right there.
Yeah, and it came right in the middle of what was called the McConaissance for a number of years, about McConaughey making the shift from the rom-coms that he'd been doing in the late 90s, early 2000s, and starting to do more awards caliber stuff. So, if you were paying attention to what he was doing around that time, you might have stumbled across this. But the other stars in this movie are really the real life townspeople in this small town in Texas where most of the action takes place.
He was the nicest guy in town.
He was about the most popular man in Carthage.
Real people person. Just made you feel real good about yourself.
It's like he'd cast a spell over the entire area.
Room service.
And she was just a mean old widow.
She used to tear up my toys. She pulled the heads off my dolls.
Well, there's some goodness in there, too.
Because the story that we're dealing with here is that of the titular Bernie Teed, or Tide. How do they pronounce it?
Teed.
Who is a local funeral director in this tiny town of Carthage in small town Texas. And this guy, played by Jack Black, he is the absolute picture of optimism. He always has a huge smile on his face. He kind of gives off a bit of a weird vibe to some people who are maybe a bit more cynical, but he just wants the best for people. And he gives away all of his money to anybody who will ask. Anybody who's in a bind, he'll give them a loan or a gift of money to help them out.
Well, because it's not his money, right? So
well, but later on, yeah, of course. But even before that, like he sort of distinguishes himself as a guy who's always willing to help people out. And the person who crosses his path, who kind of tests this personal commitment that he's made to be nice to everyone, is the character played by Shirley MacLaine, who's this elderly widow with a lot of money, a huge house in town, but she is almost universally regarded as being the one person in town everybody hates because she's mean to everybody. It's unclear exactly what led up to this, other than sort of a series of personal failings. Like she's not close with her family members, but she is the nastiest person in town, and yet Bernie tries to help her. And this sets up this kind of kept man kind of relationship, kind of like Sunset Boulevard in a way, the 1950 film. The idea of like a wealthy older woman looking after a younger man. Maybe there's sex involved, maybe not. In this case, it's pretty heavily implied that there is.
He denies it, though.
He denies it. And the younger man is very clearly taking advantage of this woman's wealth. And then despite all of Bernie's best intentions, he can't really win over Shirley MacLaine's character. He can't really change her. She's all at the core. It seems like she's still the same jealous, overprotective type of person who...
I wouldn't say she's overprotective. Maybe just domineering.
Dominant. Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. And so it builds and builds, and then eventually she's killed. And then the question becomes, did Bernie do it?
Well, no. Okay. Well, he did it. He
Yes.
confessed.
Yeah.
It's just that he is known to be such a nice person around town that there were people rooting for him not to be
Yes.
Convicted of murder.
Yes.
In fact, the story goes that the prosecutor, played by Matthew McConaughey, Danny Buck, had to move the trial 2 counties over because the county that the original trial was supposed to be set in, he couldn't find anybody. He couldn't find a jury that was willing to convict him.
Exactly.
That's how much Marjorie was hated in her town of Carthage.
Yes.
That was a very, very interesting dynamic. And if you watch the film, it feels kind of like, well, first of all, it's a dark comedy, right? And I think Linklater tries to really blur the line between reality and fiction, because it is truly one of those stories that is so bizarre it just has to be true. And I think that's the tagline for the movie anyway.
Oh yeah, at least one of them. And yeah, so it ends up being this kind of, and what Linklater does is he has Jack Black and McConaughey and Shirley MacLaine play slightly fictionalized versions of these real life people, but then he also cuts to these documentary interviews with the real life townspeople, and then they're kind of billed as like gossip chapters where the real life people give their perspective. And I don't think at the beginning of the movie they make that like explicit. They don't say what you're about to see is fictional segments with real life people. You kind of work it out as you go, I think. And so that's an interesting combination to start with.
But not all the interviews with the townspeople are documentaries. Some of them are actors.
True. Yeah.
What they did say, though, is accurate.
Exactly. Yeah. So then you have to kind of later on, like, you know, after the movie's over, you can go back and sort out who was a real person and who was an actor. I would say, like, it doesn't necessarily impact your opinion on the movie necessarily, like how much was true, how much was false, because at the end of the day, it's kind of like, it's just a fun little dark comedy story.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you hadn't seen a movie like this in a long time. And I agree they're pretty rare, but it reminds me a lot of I, Tonya.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's a good point.
It does a lot of the same things. Yeah, it's a black comedy, breaks the fourth wall a lot, has a lot of these like fake mockumentary interviews. And it's constantly tugging at you from both sides, where like sometimes you root for the main character because gosh darn, he seems such like a nice guy. And if you read into Bernie Teed's real life history, there are allegations that he had been sexually abused by an uncle for a long time.
Right.
And so there's that sort of sympathetic side to him. And then there's the other side where like he kills Marjorie and stuffs her in a freezer for 9 months and does nothing about it.
Yeah, and lives off of her wealth. So
yeah, and even then, like his defense attorney said the same thing too. He said like he lived off the wealth, yes, but he also gave it a lot away to the community. Like whether it's bringing, a choir into the town or building a new scoreboard for the local school, I think it was, or helping local businesses. Like the way they framed it was that because he had gone through this history of sexual abuse, he had sort of went through a dissociative episode and picked up the gun and shot Marjorie 4 times and ended up killing her. That part wasn't really included in the film, but if you read the story, that's kind of how they argued it. He's still in prison now, serving a life sentence, I'm pretty sure. I don't think he's eligible for parole for like another 8 years in 2029.
Exactly. And it's like the latter part of the movie becomes a bit of a courtroom drama because it follows Danny Buck,
Yes.
McConaughey's character, as he tries to collect the evidence, argue the case, and does that kind of somewhat radical move of changing the venue of the trial in an effort to get a conviction, which some people would say is maybe a bit manipulative, but I think, he rightly reasoned that it would be hard to get a conviction if it had taken place in Carthage. I was double checking like where we're at with the real life Bernie, and they actually, partially maybe due to the popularity of the film, they resentenced him.
That's right.
In I think 2016, but even though the judge agreed that maybe the first degree murder charge was not the right charge, they still sentenced him to 99 years to life. So
yeah,
he's not getting out anytime soon unless, like you said, the parole is successful.
Right. Did you know that as part of his bail that he lived with Linklater?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was part of the terms of his $10,000 bail, I think, that he had to live with Linklater. And so that kind of, like, it's not supposed to be historically accurate. It's not a documentary in any sense.
No.
But it does kind of make you wonder about how sympathetic Linklater was to Bernie Teed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And because by all accounts, he seemed like, I guess the worst way you could describe him is a used car salesman. Funeral directors make a huge living off like upselling coffins and all sorts of stuff when people die, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And he has that, personality of maybe he's not pretending, but at least on the surface, he acts like he really, really cares. And that was, I think, a really important part of his characterization, was that he was a likable guy. And yeah, I can't think of a Hollywood actor who has more of this like likable, sad puppy quality than Jack Black.
Yeah, exactly. And to be clear, we decided to talk about this movie because of Jack Black, because in the previous bonus episode, we had been talking about High Fidelity. And of course, that was a bit of a breakout role for Jack Black, at least as a featured performer. And so we figured we would follow the Jack Black connection over here to this movie that maybe a few of you out there have not heard of. But yeah, it's a bit of an interesting turn for Jack Black as an actor, because he's not doing any of his typical Jack Black shtick. He's not doing the kind of the rocking out or the faces or the spinning around or the kind of the elaborate comedy stuff that he's known for. Even though Bernie is a very cheerful character, he's cheerful in his own way, not in a Jack Black way.
He definitely plays it a lot straighter than he would if he was on Tenacious D or something.
Of course. Yeah. And I mean, some people would say, oh, he's just making a play for some sort of awards recognition. But I think it was probably a case of like, he knew what the role needed, and he'd worked with Linklater before. They trusted each other, and he probably figured, yeah, this is what's right for this movie, not to be Mr. Mr. School of Rock,
Like, he's had a really interesting career, because before this, he was kind of like sort of like a funny but small budget film kind of actor. Like, he didn't have a lot of mass appeal. And then in 2008, he did Kung Fu Panda, which was like a huge hit.
Yeah.
And instantly recognizable with his voice. And then he followed that up with Tropic Thunder, which was again a huge hit. And then people were like, okay, well, this guy's like legitimately funny. And maybe he got sort of, typecast in this like sort of slapsticks comedian sort of role. But his next two big movies, Gulliver's Travels and Year One, were both huge flops.
Yes. Yep.
So I think that kind of hurt his marketability for a while. And that's why I think maybe Bernie didn't get the attention it did, because it was kind of like Jack Black was yesterday's news until he came back with Jumanji, because there was a little time in between where he did a bunch of movies no one saw.
True. But I think, if you're an average person trying to choose what movie to watch, and you're either scrolling through Netflix or you're actually at the movie theater, if all you have is the poster and maybe the trailer to go on, you might be a bit confused about what Jack Black is doing here, because coming out of those very Jack Black-esque performances, here you have this, like in the poster for this, I think it's like a beige background. You've got Matthew McConaughey in these like 80s style glasses and this huge 10-gallon hat, Shirley MacLaine, and then Jack Black grinning right at the camera. And you might be a little bit suspicious of that. You might not know exactly what that is, and maybe less likely to take a chance on it.
I thought, without reading into the movie, I originally thought this was a movie about a local politician or something like that.
Oh, interesting.
Because he's wearing a suit in the poster.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, I thought, wow, okay, this is kind of like maybe a white collar criminal, but played by or starring a main character who was from sort of backwater area. I had no idea it was about a charming mortician. Sorry, funeral director, not mortician.
But what do you make of Linklater's role in this? Because you can see through lines in the movies that he's made. Obviously, there's the Before trilogy. He likes to make movies about Texas because that's where he's based.
Yes.
And it feels like in this case he had maybe heard about this story in the news and or read an article about it, and felt like it was a perfect kind of encapsulation of the kind of charm of small town Texas and what can happen. In the face of a murder accusation, the town is still on the murderer's side.
Yeah, could be. He's from Houston, which is like a pretty big city. But the original, I guess, source material for this movie was a 1998 article in the Texas Monthly magazine. So I imagine that's where he got the idea from. It was kind of weird seeing him in this role, Jack Black. It reminds me of Matt Damon in The Informant.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can see that.
In Steven Soderbergh, where like, I think that was close or not, like fairly soon after he did the Bourne series.
Yeah.
Or maybe in between. And he did The Informant, who's like this pudgy, overweight, dumbass FBI agent.
Or, FBI source.
Or whatever it was. And it went so much against what I had envisioned him in my mind already.
Right.
That it couldn't quite register. Jack Black, I think, plays it straight, and I think he did a really good job. But you're right. I was expecting a little more like, rock out, yeah, kind of performance. Texas as a setting is just like really interesting because it's almost like a country in itself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think Linklater said at some point that like this was the Fargo-esque story of Texas. And there are definitely a lot of beats that are very similar. Texas is so big, like everything's regionalized. There's this one part where he's interviewing this guy in a cafe and he's going through the different parts of Texas and he's got every region labeled with some sort of stereotype. And I thought that was hilarious. But I do think there's some sort of like Southern charm in movies that sort of can act as a buffer to really gruesome murder stories. Have you ever seen The Lady Killers? I feel like I've mentioned this movie before.
Are you thinking of the Coen Brothers remake of the original from like the 50s?
Yeah, the Tom Hanks one.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's a similar story where it's like a pretty gruesome story about a group of like con men and murders.
Yeah.
But somehow there's like that Southern charm veneer over it. And you just can't quite decide if you really like these characters and think they're cute or if you really hate them because they're awful people.
Yeah.
So that's like the constant tug of war in this film. And I think Linklater did a good job. The only kind of gripe I have is for someone who's really good with like conveying a passage of time in his movies, either through Boyhood or the Sunset series, I don't think he does a really good job here. Like, I had trouble placing the year the movie was set in.
Right.
I had trouble understanding how long that relationship lasted before he shot Marjorie. And I had very little sense of time about how like the whole investigation and trial unraveled. And I'm not sure he was his goal, because he kind of showed snippets. There, like half the movie's dedicated to these fake interviews with townspeople, and what they thought about, you know, both Marjorie and Bernie, which is fine. It's funny. I just thought that was sort of a curious departure from what I have learned to know through Linklater.
Yeah,
films.
no, that's a good point.
And it's funny, his name is Linklater, you know, like Lincoln later. You know, it's kind of time related.
I guess. No, that's a good point, because like, yeah, he normally does have like time is a factor in a lot of his movies, and in this, maybe because he's cutting together the fictionalized stuff with the documentary footage, or maybe like, I don't think he uses a whole lot of like graphics or things to kind of convey the passage of time. I think it's all kind of smooshed together, right?
Because like the characters don't really change physically and looks over time, even though it's set to take place over at least a few years. I think, like, I'm still not even sure how much time elapsed.
Yeah, like from when they're supposed to have met to the actual murder, and then the conclusion of the trial.
It was like 6 or 7 years, because he had met her in 1990 and then he killed her in 96. So yeah, 6 years.
Right. And not to mention that the documentary footage is all like recorded, like, I guess it would have been recorded in like 2010, 2011 maybe, when closer to when the movie came out. So it's not like the townspeople are going to be dressed in the styles of the 90s or anything like that.
Well, it was just really hard to tell like what was actual documentary footage, excluding the end credits during the film. I for a long time, and I still think that all the interviews were filmed with actors.
Like you said, there's a few actors in there, you know, cases where it was like a really important voice to have in the story, but then that particular real life person wasn't comfortable participating. I think like the funeral home directors were like the other people who worked with Bernie at the funeral home. That was an example where they wanted to convey the idea that Bernie had coworkers who had noticed his quirks, but then the real life place where Bernie worked, I don't think they wanted to participate in the movie because they were worried about,
right.
I think there was some quote about how they knew that the movie was going to be a dark comedy, and they were worried that it would kind of reflect poorly on their business if they were seen to take place in to take part in something that was like poking fun at a serious crime, you know?
I remember reading that when the movie was released, it kind of divided the town a little bit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, I would say most autobiographical or most historical films would divide the critics and audiences, because I mean, so much of history is subjective, and for a lot of them, they probably had some sort of emotional or sentimental tie to either character.
Yeah.
It's a small town, right? Like, you and I have both lived or been to small towns. It is very insular.
Yeah, and even like if you've got a local person like Shirley MacLaine's character who is kind of almost universally disliked or even hated, it's not like people are showing up on their doorstep with torches and pitchforks to run them out of town. You know, they're just they're kind of tolerated because it's a small town and everyone knows each other's families going way back. So it's kind of like, oh, that's just so-and-so, you know, we just put up with her.
Yeah. Usually now we just throw rocks at each other or write messages on social media.
Yeah. Get on, what's that app for neighbors ratting on each other, Nextdoor?
There's an app for that? Christ, there's an app for everything. That's stupid. Oh my God.
Yeah. Sometimes you get some hilarious stories from that. Like,
I know, but it makes people passive aggressive.
Oh yeah. No, it's an app that's 100% based on passive aggressiveness. But
anyway, I'm curious, why do you think it wasn't as not commercially successful, but why do you think it flew under the radar so much and not many people knew about this film?
I'm just purely basing this on instinct. I don't know for sure, but I would say lack of familiarity with the case. Like, you know, it was obviously a well-known story in Texas, but you quiz 10 people on the street and ask them about Bernie Teed, the funeral home director. They probably, if they weren't familiar with this movie, they probably would have never heard of it. So it wasn't not like it had national profile or anything.
No, I think outside, even within Texas, I'd be surprised if people outside of the Carthage area knew about this story.
Right. And I think, like, you know, just as in general as a filmmaker, Linklater is a very understated kind of guy. Like School of Rock is the biggest movie he ever made in terms of box office. And in many ways, it actually feels less like a Linklater film because it doesn't have his more kind of chill, stonery vibes. It's more like it's got the more upbeat studio comedy kind of sensibility. So if you're like cruising around for movies to watch, you may not gravitate to a Linklater movie because they're so chill and they're so like unassuming.
Right. And before that, like he had did A Scanner Darkly and Bad News Bears, which weren't like huge hits. Definitely not A Scanner Darkly. And then he kind of worked very seldomly. I think he only did Me and Orson Welles in 2008 before he did Bernie, and then Before Midnight, and then Boyhood came after.
Yeah.
So this was kind of before he became really, really famous. Not that he wasn't before.
Yeah, I think he was really well known in like the indie film world, like people who knew his stuff, who knew Slacker and Dazed and Confused, who were familiar with all of his early stuff in the 90s. And early 2000s, they would obviously know exactly who he was and were probably following him, but it was probably a pretty small circle, So he had fans who would obviously run out and see it as soon as they heard people like me, maybe, who would run out and see it as soon as they heard about it. And then, yeah, I mean, it really wasn't until Boyhood that he even got any kind of significant attention from the Oscars, for example.
I can't remember how Before Sunrise was received when it first was released, because we would have been like less than 10 years old at the time.
Yeah, for sure.
But he definitely had this like image and reputation of being like a low budget indie film director.
Very much. Yeah. And like super well known in the Austin film circle, which has its own kind of community, but beyond that,
Yeah, exactly. How did you end up coming by this film?
It was probably like me trawling around through IMDb back around when it came out and noticing that like Jack Black and McConaughey had worked together on this thing. And I remember watching the trailer around when it came out, but then like I said, I just sort of put it on the back burner, and it wasn't until it popped up on Prime last year that I remembered. I was like, oh yeah, I gotta watch this thing. So there was definitely a huge stretch of time where it was just it was hard to find on streaming. It wasn't easy to get. You had to make an effort. But yeah, then out of an interest of like doing a bit of Linklater completionism, I figured I had to tick it off.
If you had to shortlist, what would you have shortlisted Bernie for? Jack Black was really good, I thought.
If it was like a year without a lot of huge movies, then probably Best Actor for Jack Black. I don't know that I would go screenplay.
Oh, interesting. I mean, that's always a tough category, but that's an interesting one. I think they did a pretty good job of it.
It would be adapted screenplay, but yeah.
So that year for Best Actor, John Dujardin won for The Artist.
That was The Artist's year.
Yeah, and the Best Adapted Screenplay went to The Descendants.
Right. So, I mean, it would have had a hard time competing against The Descendants because that was a huge crowd pleaser.
Did you like The Descendants?
I remember loving it at the time. I haven't revisited it
really good.
In a long time. I also remember loving The Artist. That has kind of fallen in certain critics' estimations since then. A lot of people...
I did not really enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, we've had similar conversations about other kind of like movies about movies before.
Yeah, fair enough.
I tend to go in for them. I like that kind of stuff, but at the time it was a huge sensation, and then the energy behind it's kind of died off. So
I will say that Bernie, I think, doesn't really catch your attention. Like you kind of drift through the movie a little bit, because the conflict between Marjorie and Bernie isn't really robust.
No,
like it's just sort of, they paint this image of Marjorie as this like really miserly old woman, and she is, but you never see Jack Black's character kind of build up a frustration towards that.
No, not until he kind of snaps in that one scene.
And when he does snap, it's kind of weird because he's so emotionless throughout the whole thing, right? I think in that particular scene, he did play up that dissociative episode that the real Bernie claimed to have when he shot Marjorie. So I thought that was interesting. But I mean, the only times we ever really saw Marjorie picking on Bernie is, being really annoying, calling him to do random stuff, being really, really needy. But the sort of the linchpin of his frustration with her is the fact that she chews refried beans 25 times when they go to eat Mexican food.
Right.
I thought that was an interesting choice. I can see why that might snap Bernie, because that would annoy the hell out of me too. But it just seems so sudden.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's his choice, or he just didn't know at the time about Bernie's history of being sexually abused.
Yeah, because it's, if you're talking about the real life Bernie, who knows what the trigger really was. It could have been like he saw something in Marjorie that he associated with his abuser, for example. So then the question is like, how deep was Jack Black's research? Like, how much did he talk to the real life Bernie? How many of those things did he map over from stuff that he'd talked about and research that he'd done, and how much was it just kind of instinctive type stuff?
And also, like, from an ethical standpoint, can you make a dark comedy about sexual abuse? You can definitely make it about murder. We've seen it tons of times.
Oh yeah.
But can you make a dark comedy out of sexual abuse, especially of a minor?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you can. Like, there's no way.
I mean, you could try, but you would you would have people wanting to burn your house down within short order.
Yeah, I mean, anybody could try. I really don't recommend it, because there are certain things I think that are just too sensitive and too dark, I think, to be made fun of.
Yeah. It's definitely a line in the sand.
But the whole film is like pretty cheery in nature. There's no like ominous dark music even when he shoots her. It's not meant to be scary, and there's not even really a build up to it.
No, I think there's a couple of scenes that kind of set up the how the happy-go-lucky relationship they had was starting to degrade, but then it does come pretty quickly. And I think ultimately, I mean, the cheerfulness is partially centered around the town and the fact that at the end,
the town's characters are hilarious.
Yeah, at the end of the day, like these are very forgiving people, obviously, and I think Linklater's making the point that
simple-minded. I think
maybe I think he's being a bit nicer to them than that, but he's clearly trying to paint them in a good light and show how open-minded they are to this situation. And it's been a while now, but did they get into the moral problems that they might have had between Bernie being a younger man and sort of quasi dating an older woman?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, they give you this like quote unquote fact, and then they give you like 20 different interpretations by all the townspeople.
Right. And that's where the gossip kind of stuff really kicks in.
Yeah, the gossip starts. So is Bernie gay? Was their relationship sexual? Those are kind of like things that were discussed but remained ambiguous. I don't know, from what I've read about the actual people, it seemed like it was non-sexual and Bernie was gay.
Right.
But him and Marjorie just kind of developed, I guess, in a weird way, sort of like a mother-son kind of relationship.
Yeah.
Because she had been estranged from her family. They all hated her. She clearly hated them. He clearly had issues with his own family too. And it was just one of those things where I guess they found some sort of comfort in each other. And I remember him saying that, like, the Marjorie that I knew was not the Marjorie that you guys knew. And clearly they had some sort of connection that no one else was able to have. And I think relationships like that are always really difficult to interpret.
Yes.
Because it's not common. It's not something that everyone can understand. But I mean, if you're in your 40s and you have like a relationship that's really close to someone who might be your grandma's age, I don't really, or your mother's age, I don't really see a big problem with it.
No.
I mean, we get all these all hung up about like, the age difference between couples. And I get there's a point where it's kind of creepy,
Yeah.
But past the age of 30 or whatever, it's just kind of like, who cares, man?
The way the relationship starts, at least as depicted in the movie, kind of suggests that, like, to Bernie, it's almost like a Marjorie is a tough nut to crack, or she's like a project for him. Like
for sure.
The way it's presented is that he is able to make friends no matter where he goes in town because he's just so unfailingly nice to everybody, and she's the one person that his charm doesn't work on. So he takes it upon himself to correct this problem by saying, I'm going to get through to her, I'm going to fix her. And that's how it starts. And then I think maybe midway through or towards the end of the relationship, it's less about him trying to fix her and him being stuck. And that precipitates the shooting, I think.
In my life, I felt like I've met more Marjories than Bernies. What about you?
Oh, yeah, I guess if I'm being cynical, I would say I would agree with you. Yeah.
Is this a question of cynicism, though?
Well, I mean, it's true that
I've also never met anyone who seems to be as nice as Bernie, and anyone who is that nice who I've met, who are like super friendly, super helpful, I'm always like automatically suspicious. I'm just like, what? Who are you and what do you want?
No, I'm the same on that. Yeah. You do suspect ulterior motives when somebody is being so over the top nice to you.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just the wicked world we live in. But
but have you ever met a person like Bernie in real life?
Oh yeah, at least a handful at various points. Like whether it's like,
where do you meet them?
Like at least one time it was like some sort of church service that I might have been at. Like you meet somebody in that context. Obviously that those kind of places would probably attract people like Bernie. And as you see in the movie, he's like a choir director, so he's very much at home in that environment. But like elsewhere, I mean, I guess. Certain salespeople obviously lay it on pretty thick.
Yeah, but they're trying to sell you something.
Yeah, right? The question is like how much of a deal are they pitching you? Are they like moving heaven and earth for you and making it seem like they are your absolute best friend?
Those are probably the best salesmen.
Yeah, exactly. But like, how much guile do you feel in the transaction, right? So, because some of them are really good at hiding it.
I agree, and that's where like him being a funeral director kind of gets me, because I've heard lots of stories about how these people really upsell you on things because they take advantage of people's grief.
Sure, yeah, and you're in the situation where you want to get it over, you want to get a funeral over and done with, and you don't want to deliberate too long, so they got you between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, and also makes you feel like being practical is a sort of insult to a dead person.
Sure, yeah.
Like you got to splurge on this nice wooden casket, you got to spend this on flowers, you got to do this and that and blah 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 blah. But what kind of made me think twice was like, he quit his job to be with her, but I guess when you're spending that much money, it's a pretty easy decision to make. He must not have been making very much as an assistant funeral director.
No, I mean, from what I know about what funeral directors make, it wouldn't have been a huge amount of money, and of course they also demonstrated that before he met her, he was also giving gifts, and he wasn't taking advantage of what he was making as a funeral director, If
you had a benefactor like that, Rob, what would you spend the money on?
I would try to convince them to get me into con, for example. That would be something.
Well, that'd be easy. That's just a field trip. If you're talking about like having an entry in the film festival, that's completely different.
Oh, well.
But by all means, if you have enough money, you could probably just go.
Either or, yeah, that just hanging out in the French Riviera, yeah, that would be rubbing shoulders with the rich and famous. You don't say no to that.
Is France like your number one destination?
No, not necessarily. It was just the first thing that popped into my head because Con happened a few months ago, and whenever you see footage from that, it always looks like the heaven of movie going or whatever.
It's not you're not into like buy me a new house, buy me a car.
Oh sure, I mean if I'm thinking more practically, yeah.
I mean the possibilities are endless.
Yes, yeah.
But honestly, like if you had a benefactor like that, what would you do?
Well, yeah, I mean there's a lot riding on that because it depends on the benefactor. I would say like what are they getting out of it too? You gotta like maybe customize.
You're their paramour, Rob.
Okay, so we're saying like I am Bernie, and I do have this woman who may or may not be in a romantic relationship with me.
Yeah, and keep in mind, like for you, that romantic relationship is probably not a huge issue.
Okay, yeah, this is a hard thing to role play because I have a hard time imagining myself in this situation.
Just think of that old benefactor as I don't know, Meryl Streep or something.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, honestly,
or Queen Elizabeth.
honestly, yeah, you gotta take on the creature comforts. You gotta do the trips. You gotta have the nice cars, I guess. I mean,
I can totally see why Bernie would give a lot of it away. It seems like a nice thing.
yeah, I'm pretty sure Bernie is way nicer than I ever will be. So
really, I can see you taking some money and donating it.
I feel like I would make some charitable donations, but I don't think I would be quite as self-effacing.
Like, I wouldn't buy jet skis for my neighbors, but hell, if the local school needs a little help, I'll give you a blank check, right?
Okay, so then I got to turn it back around. So what would be the trip or the piece of property that you would spring for?
I definitely buy like residences all over the world and just travel, but I'd also give a lot of it away as well. Like whatever I don't use.
What exactly? She's a millionaire, right? So she's not like.
So apparently her estate was worth $10 million.
Okay. So it's not like
her husband had been an oil guy,
right,
during the booming business, and when they moved to Carthage or maybe some other small town, I can't remember, they had invested in a bunch of local businesses, including a bank.
Right. Yes.
So that's what she was talking about in regards to the royalty checks. I assumed that had something to do with the oil business, and her grandkids had sued her over a trust fund of some sort.
Yes.
So like she was wealthy. Like $10 million is a lot of money, but I mean, $10 million these days. Unfortunately, I have to say it's like you're not ultra rich.
No. Yeah. So if you're going for the dream of having multiple residences around the world, we're not talking like fancy places with infinity pools and 10,000 square feet. It's like
one fancy place in Switzerland or something will probably cost half that money already.
Exactly. So yeah, you gotta go like suburban chic for each of those places.
Just Airbnb it, I guess. Airbnb a castle or something for 2 weeks. But I mean, if you live in a place like Carthage, I can't imagine your expenses are that high. And old people, they don't spend that much anyway. Well, she did because they went on trips, but you get to a point where you kind of stop spending money because you either can't do it or there's nothing you want to spend it on.
Well, in fact, before we started recording, I came across an article about something that she could have blown almost the entire fortune on, and that would be a luxury RV that has a garage for a Bugatti hypercar underneath the undercarriage of the RV.
I think I've seen this before.
So it drives around and then it gets to its destination and then the little door opens and a Bugatti Chiron comes out.
At this point, wouldn't you rather buy a house?
Yeah, probably. I mean, if the decision is like it's
you just bought an expensive carry case for your Bugatti. That's what it is.
Basically. Yeah. And the hilarious thing is going into the comments under these articles and seeing how the RV nerds are pointing out all of the flaws in the interiors of the.
Those things are not designed for practicality anyway. Like that misses the point, you know? It's like, yeah, no one needs to freaking live in a $10 million mansion.
Yeah.
Unless you have like 50 kids. There's just no practical reason for it. But people do it because they can.
You end up doing house tours on YouTube where you're leading the camera through basically empty halls because you can't afford all the furniture and art that would actually make the place look halfway decent.
Whoever's living there has probably used like 2 of the 20 rooms that they have.
Yeah.
And that like game room that they, tried to turn into their man cave, they probably like used it once. It's just like, hey, I have it. All right, I'm done. What's next?
So the moral of this is that would not buy the RV with the Bugatti. I think that would be
just get the Bugatti.
Yeah, just the Bugatti.
But yeah, like thanks for recommending this movie. I enjoyed it. I like black comedies like this, but yeah, it's the first time. It reminded me of I, Tonya, but you're right. We don't see a lot of these movies very often.
Exactly, yeah. And so, I mean, I'm not sure where we will spin off from here for our next bonus episode. It'll be some person who is represented in this movie. We haven't quite decided yet.
It's got to be McConaughey, right? He's got the biggest web.
I mean, and maybe the next governor of Texas. Who knows?
Well, I mean, I was just thinking McConaughey has some really bad movies when he first started out. So we can go, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days rom-com, or we can go, the sci-fi action route where he did that movie he did with Christian Bale. What's it called?
Oh, Reign of Fire.
Reign of Fire.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember Reign of Fire.
So a lot of directions we could go.
Yeah, so of course, stay tuned for that. But that may not be the next episode you hear. We, of course, have a couple of film festivals coming up. So the Toronto International Film Festival, I'll be at that. We will also be covering Vancouver International Film Festival. So we may fit that into a quickly upcoming episode. And then it seems like there are some big movies on the horizon, like No Time to Die and Dune, which, unless they get rescheduled, we will definitely be talking about. We've got big plans for those when they do come out.
Been a long time coming.
Yes, and, unlike Tom Cruise, they are not bowing to COVID, so we will hopefully be gracing our eyeballs with that in the not too distant future. But until the next episode, my name is Robert Snow in Toronto.
And my name is Jason Chen in Vancouver. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.